It is my sincerest pleasure to welcome Dr. Priscilla Lui to the 58th Nobel Conference here at Gustavus Adolphus College. Dr. Lui, an associate professor of psychology at Southern Methodist University, aims to inspire students to shed light on or solve real-world problems. And as we know, one of the largest real-world problems right now is mental health, specifically the mental health of children, adolescents, and young adults. Dr. Lui earned her PhD in clinical psychology from Purdue University, where she started disentangling specific risks to mental health among minority populations. Understanding how the experiences of people from diverse sociocultural backgrounds affects their psychological well-being and externalization of symptoms is central to Dr. Lui's research. Dr. Lui serves as the principal investigator of the Acculturation, Diversity, and Psychopathology Team, also known as ADAPT, at Southern Methodist University, leading research that aims to inform and influence clinical interventions for culturally diverse populations. Dr. Lui continues to propel her research trajectory that investigates racial inequality by focusing on the association between microaggression and adjustment outcomes, such as self-esteem, perceived stress, affect, and symptoms of depression and anxiety. Dr. Lui has identified that adjustment outcomes related to microaggressions are like those with overt discrimination, with significant impact on one's mental health. However, she emphasizes a salient need to differentiate microaggression from overt discrimination as it captures unique variances of social groups, illuminating the need for continued investigation of these concepts to guide clinical interventions. Leveraging knowledge about cultural values in mental health is integral in the pursuit of providing effective interventions and care. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Lui as she sheds light on the lived experiences associated with culture, ethnicity, and race in order to inform future action.
All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. All right, I'm gonna stand here just to make our camera crew's lives difficult because I'm gonna pace around a little bit. Is everybody hearing me okay? Awesome, all right. So I know our first speaker is very brave. Thank you for getting us started. Hopefully, just bear with us in terms of some technical issues. So thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm so excited to be here. A little bit of a perk for me to be here in Minnesota is for me to be able to escape Texas heat. But really, I think this conference is so unique in the sense that it's public-facing. It's not, just researchers talking to other researchers and talking about our data in our own ivory tower, but really kind of talking about how can we use science and think about the ethics of using science as a way to understand, serve, and really advocate for people of all backgrounds, and particularly those of the highest needs. So I'm very pleased with this year's theme because it's very important and timely, but it's also some of the things I'm really passionate about. So let's see if my slide will work. If not, I'm gonna signal my people behind the scene and advance slides. So can we show some slides here? Let's see if that works. All right, I don't think are people in the back seeing the slide? No? Okay, there we go. All right, so we have something going. All right, so my research generally concerns health disparities and minority mental health. And what that means is I am particularly interested in mental health problems and addictive behaviors, focusing on the experiences of ethnic minority youth. So when I talk about, when I talk about health disparities or mental health disparities particularly, I'm really talking about differences in mental health conditions across groups. And uniquely, when we talk about disparities or inequities, we're speaking to the idea that there are differences in mental health outcomes and conditions and the disease burden facing socially disadvantaged populations. So in our conversation, we're namely talking about ethnic minority youth and young adults because society-wise, they are underserved, understudied, and they don't have as many resources as their more privileged peers, including white and Euro-Americans. So what's particularly striking about mental health disparities is not only do we see some differences in mental health problems, the prevalence rates, or maybe severity levels, what's particularly important to understand is the disease burden of mental health conditions. So if we're talking about the same mental health problems, even at the same level, ethnic minority individuals actually see more severe, more chronic, more debilitating symptoms, and they actually also suffer from worse personal and social costs associated with having these sufferings. So in a lot of ways, health disparities really speak to a critical public health problem, as well as an equity issue. So that's kind of why we're here the next 2 days talking about. So my research, particularly focused on some unique sort of facets of lived experiences that might help us understand why do we continue seeing mental health disparities, and what are some social, cultural drivers that sustain and also kind of perpetuate problems associated with ethnic minorities' mental health problems. So some of these, I think Dr. Tynes, mentioned briefly in her talk, is that, I think minority populations are less likely to receive high-quality care, and they're also not necessarily able to get care that is culturally responsive to their unique social conditions and their cultural beliefs and their needs. So this could be based on a variety of social conditions, but one key set of sociocultural drivers of health disparities have to do with racism and discrimination. So when I talk about racism, it is this belief that certain groups, particularly groups of color, ethnic minority populations, are inferior to whites. And these beliefs stem from social prejudice and biased stereotypes about ethnic minority populations. And these can manifest in several ways, both cultural beliefs-wise, social media images that we see, as well as can be manifested in interpersonal exchanges. And those are the things that we refer to as discrimination. So discrimination, when we typically think about discrimination, we might think about these discrete events that are very blatant. So violent attacks, exclusions, and harassment. So things that we might think about, those civil rights violations don't happen as much anymore in people's day-to-day lives. On the other hand, discrimination also can manifest in people's day-to-day lives. And these everyday discrimination are maybe more minor racism-related stressors that we generally just walk off, just shrug off our shoulders and don't really think about. But then they still can take a toll on young people's lives because they might dwell on it. It might actually, add up to their psychological burden over time. So everyday discrimination might be more insidious and happens more frequently. And sometimes we kind of discount their total effects on young people's mental health. So one of the reasons that I, as a clinical psychologist, I'm interested in minority mental health is I particularly focus on psychological distress as well as alcohol use. So the reason I study alcohol use is for a number of reasons, not just to say this is me search, is it's one of the most commonly used substances in the United States, right? So 85% of people in the US drink alcohol at some point in their life, and about 50% of the population consume alcohol at least once a week. I might have partook in some of that last night, right? So alcohol use also is commonly used as a way to cope with psychological distress, particularly if we believe it has a stress dampening effect. So for young people who are experiencing a lot of pressures, whether it's be loneliness or which we'll talk about tomorrow, or racism and discrimination-related stressors or academic stress, alcohol use can be a maladaptive coping mechanism. So for alcohol use, particularly for young people, it's highly important and relevant issue to talk about because it actually is relatively prevalent among young people. So about 37% of the US population of young adults actually meet diagnostic criteria for alcohol use disorder, which is a very high rate. And we also know that for adolescents going into young adulthood, we see an increase in alcohol consumption. Particularly, alcohol use, the rates of general alcohol consumption as well as risky use actually peak during 18 to 25-year-olds. So sort of the population that we're speaking to a lot in this conference. So in the sense that alcohol use can be used as a coping mechanism against distress, I am interested in kind of understanding the link between alcohol use symptoms, psychological distress as an effect of racism and discrimination. Now, we might think, well, we're in 2022, we don't really see these discrete events of major blatant racism and discrimination as frequently anymore. So is racism still a thing? I love this image, this gif of this adolescent here. I want to engage our audience members in person here. Think about how often do you think ethnic minority youth actually experience racial discrimination? So I want us to show by clapping, out of these 4 options. So by volume, we can kind of see where the consensus might be, okay? So is it once a month that ethnic minority youth experience racial discrimination? Anybody? Nobody. Thank you, 1 person, all right? Once a week? Okay. What about 2 to 3 times a week? Right? Maybe people are just now awake. 3 to 5 times a day. Wow. Okay, well, thank you. So really based on psychological data, oftentimes, actually, as Dr. Tynes mentioned, some come from daily diary studies, which I'll get into talking about a little bit here, is it averages about once a week to 5 times a day, depending on kind of the data sets that we're talking about and also the ethnic minority populations that people come from. And on the high end, it tends to be African American youth, and data sets coming from Asian Americans suggest at least once a week, okay? So some of the daily experiences with discrimination might be relatively benign, and they might look like something like this. Okay, so we might say, well, some of these comments are really not that bad. Are they really discriminatory? Are they really taking a toll on people? Are people overreacting? And some of these might even sound like compliments to ethnic minority youth. So in a lot of ways, data suggests that maybe experiences with discrimination has really turned much more subtle and much more ambiguous and much more insidious. And briefly we mentioned the word microaggression, which I get into in a little bit here. So far, in terms of psychological science in giving us data about the associations between racial discrimination-related stress and mental health outcomes among young people have come from observational research. So what that means is researchers either have interviews or focus groups asking people to recall and share their stories and narratives about their lived experiences with discrimination, as well as their mental health conditions. Other types of observational research typically rely on survey designs, like the images here, is that people might, in one sitting, kind of think about maybe their lifetime experiences with everyday discrimination, or maybe in a specific time, say in the past year or past 30 days, experiences with everyday discrimination, and they fill out survey questionnaires, and at the same time also talk about their general mental health statuses. Now, some more intensive survey research more and more, as Dr. Tynes mentioned, can be used as daily diary studies or what we call ecological momentary assessments. So these are survey data that repeatedly happen. So we get people to answer these questionnaires in short spurts, daily or multiple times a day, in their natural lived-in environments, maybe at home, at school, anything that happens in a day, they talk about their experiences with everyday discrimination. So there is a problem with observational research, as we so far have done, though, is people have a lot of variability in terms of what they think about as discrimination, how they interpret those situations. And then also, when we think about mental health problems, there's a host of factors that relate to mental health conditions as well. And these could be personality vulnerabilities, history with other stressors, and what else is happening. Maybe, hey, there's a COVID pandemic that can affect people's mental health problems that may not have anything to do with racism and discrimination. So with observational research, we really can't make the causal claim that people's mental health problems is because of racism and discrimination experiences. Here comes along in-lab experimental studies. So on the other hand, we can actually, as researchers, bring participants into our psychology lab and impose them to standardized, tightly controlled situations where we know this is a discrimination experience. And we standardize it across research participants so that these individual differences in what they consider as discrimination is washed out. And we can assess in real time their responses, maybe thoughts, emotions in response to these discrimination stimuli in the lab setting. Well, there's also a problem with experimental research, is that they typically happens in a lab setting like the picture here, and researchers are observing, but how many times do people go into a psychology research lab behind a one-way mirror? Discrimination and mental health, our lived experiences happen in the real world, right? People have interpersonal exchanges in the grocery store, when you're waiting in line, maybe at a football game, or when you go to the bar, some people start a conversation, you're like, that was kind of awkward, or maybe racist, right? So experiments aren't really bringing us to understand in people's naturalistic lived experiences, environments. So we also have a problem here that it's not really ecologically valid. So advances in virtual reality technologies can actually bridge the problems and address some of the limitations in both observational and in-lab experimental studies. So researchers have used virtual reality for quite a bit, for maybe at least 10 years, in psychological science in particular. So we can actually use virtual reality to help people get exposure therapy for phobia objects such as spiders or heights. So it actually has been used in psychological science, but not so much in terms of basic research understanding of mental health problems or basic understanding of the effects of these harmful experiences such as discrimination and racism. So in our lab, we actually have been using virtual reality as a tool to address the limitations in observational research and in lab assignments, combined with experimental designs where we have tight control of what the experiences of discrimination might be, but immerse participants into naturalistic environments, such as a bar or house parties, where they have natural interpersonal exchanges as they would in real life, and we can assess in real time their genuine responses, and then also, kind of get them to kind of report how they experience, what they would do, and then kind of assess a range of mental health outcomes associated with racism and discrimination. And let's be real, we're talking about young people, right? I know you love your technology. You're on your phones with your TikToks and your Instagram all the time and running out to get the latest video games. So young people love this when we talk about virtual reality, and they run to our study and want to participate and contribute to science. So this is what they come into our lab, and that might look like. They come into our lab and they wear virtual reality goggles, and we expose them, kind of get them acclimated, and expose them to the virtual reality environment. And we have sort of different conditions that we might assign randomly research participants to experience different levels of discrimination or no discrimination at all. And then we ask them to report how they feel and then what they would do immediately after the virtual reality simulation. In this study, we brought in 185 ethnic minority young adults with an average age of 24 of diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds, and half of them are full-time college students and the other half are in the community. And we assigned randomly these 185 research participants to 4 conditions. So the first one is actually a control condition where they experience just normal conversations but elicit some type of stress that's related to daily hassles. So if they talk about finances, academic, school-related stresses, work-related issues, and things that are not tied directly to race and racism. And the other 3 conditions are discrimination-related experiences. So the first one is sort of what we call more blatant, more overt discrimination. So the last video that we just watched is an example of that quote-unquote major discrimination. And then 2 other conditions are what researchers have called microaggressions. And micro-insult, generally refers to ethnic minorities being put down and kind of slighted, and could be a backhanded compliment. So, for example, African Americans are assumed as highly athletic and not being admitted to a prestigious school because of their intelligence. And microinvalidation would be an example of the one that we first saw, the first video, where ethnic minority individuals are basically invalidated that race and racism are part of their day-to-day experience. So kind of colorblind approach to thinking about their lived experiences. So our research, a little bit background about our research participants. So in general, we asked them about their lifetime experiences with discrimination, and they report relatively very low levels of major discrimination. So being fired from a job or being not able to get an apartment because of their racial background. And they also rarely report experiences with everyday discrimination. So for example, being followed around in a store or assumed they're up to no good. So they're relatively well-protected group of young adults. And in terms of their alcohol use consumption, they're kind of what we consider as occasional drinkers. So they don't really drink very frequently, even though to be part of our study, they have to have engaged in alcohol consumption in the past 30 days and also identify as a person of color and not being an international student or a temporary visitor to the United States. So we asked our participants kind of how much they typically drink. So we show them this image of what a standardized drink is, typical table wine or not high alcohol content beers. So obviously, as you can imagine, young adults drink more on the weekends than compared to a typical weekday. So compared to the participants in the control condition where they talk about daily stressors but not related to racism and discrimination, participants assigned to any of the 3 discrimination-related conditions rated, as you saw from the stress meter on the screen there, they rated higher levels of stress. And at the end of the virtual reality simulations, we also asked them the intensity of their negative emotions. And participants in the discrimination conditions related higher levels of negative emotions compared to folks in the control condition. So these could be anger and anxiety and frustration. And what's interesting was we asked them immediately following the virtual reality simulations among these drinkers, how much urge do you have to consume alcohol right now as a way of coping, perhaps? And opposite to our expectation, because we expected folks in the discrimination condition actually would report higher levels of alcohol craving, it's quite the opposite. This effect is statistically significant, albeit a small effect, is that participants in the control condition actually reported slightly higher levels of alcohol craving than folks in the discrimination condition. So we wanted to unpack this a little bit and see, are there sort of different effects across these different levels, or some researchers consider them as different types, distinctive types of discrimination? And what we saw was that all 3 conditions of discrimination are statistically significantly different in rating higher levels of stress than folks in the control condition. But among the 3 severity levels of discrimination, there were no meaningful differences in terms of their stress experiences. And we saw the same effect with regard to negative emotions. What's interesting about alcohol craving was that the only statistically significant effect was between the micro-invalidation condition, where people are told we're in a colorblind society, compared to the control condition, as shown by the red asterisk. And the other two more severe levels of racial discrimination were not statistically significantly different than the control condition. And again, there were really no significant differences among the three racial discrimination conditions. So some takeaways here, I'm looking forward to more discussions with other speakers and with the audience members, is that yes, racism and discrimination still occur in young people's day-to-day lives, and they do hurt. And in some ways, virtual reality can be a very helpful tool to help us understand the effect of discrimination in the real world, and potentially can be a viable tool to help us deliver some prevention and intervention, and kind of help people practice maybe being a bystander or being able to resist the urges to consume alcohol when they are stressed. So I'll leave you with that, and follow me on social media and kind of our lab, Adapt 206, and moving to the University of Washington. So with the QR code, you can find my new faculty website. Thank you.